everybody. Welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we're going to be talking about stoking the creative fires, particularly in writing. And we have Phil Consineau here who is going to be sharing his wisdom. So welcome, Phil.
Oh, we did it. We surmounted the technological obstacles to simple human conversation.
I mean, but isn't it miraculous? You're in San Francisco, I'm in Seattle, and we're talking. So, hooray for technology.
Wonderful. Yes. And thank you to my son for helping.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, your son. Thank you for the youth that help us figure out technology. All right. So I want to talk to you about this book. And
Sure.
Also, you're coming to Seattle and you're going to be talking about the soulful side of writing, which I love. And they're all intricately related. So how is stoking the creative fires and writing related to you?
Great question. This particular book comes out of 30 plus years of teaching film writing, radio, TV writing, the writing of books, the writing of journalism. And over the years, I've discovered there's an image, a symbol that helps constellate this work. And it works in two ways. Many listeners, viewers will remember that I worked with the great mythologist Joseph Campbell and wrote the movie, The Hero's Journey, and the book about his life. And in there, Campbell came up with a very useful image that goes all the way back to antiquity, that your soul is round. Even Van Gogh had described, I think life is round. There's a lot of images about this. You leave home, you come home, and you know the place for the first time, like in T.S. Eliot. So the hero's journey is a circle. You leave home, but Campbell's innovation was that it's not clockwise, it's counterclockwise. The clockwise journey in anything, relationship, writing a book or an opera, taking a trip, most journeys are tick, 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 goes the clock. You go around and around, you follow the clock. But all stories and all creativity go against time. That's why it feels like it's stopping time to watch a great movie for 2 hours. Or you lose time, 4 hours of singing practice or 4 hours in a ball game. When you do the things you love, you're stopping time. And that's why the journey is counterclockwise. Just imagine the hands on your clock on the wall going backwards. That gives you a little visceral sense of why people love to create. You go into the bubble. You go into the zone. It feels like time stops. And most people will say, I'm never more alive than when I'm creating something. So I use that notion from the hero's journey to also talk about pilgrimage. Probably my biggest selling, most popular book is on the art of pilgrimage. How can you turn any journey into something soulful? You use this model of stopping time. And that then becomes the inspiration for stoking the creative fires in this sense. I work with kids. I remember going in and teaching my son Jack's class, second, third, fourth, fifth grade writing class. The teachers love to have a role writer to come in. But I'm leaving tomorrow to also give some consultations down at Warner Brothers on movies. I'm giving talks. I'm going to be interviewing Alfred Hitchcock. How do they connect people's issue, problems, obstacles with creativity? Invariably have to do with time and space. Finding the right time, the amount of time, and making that time holy. It's not just, I have 10 minutes left at the end of the work day, or maybe I can carve in 1 month, 1 day next month. Creativity time has to be sacred. You have to say it. You have to use the word. You have to say it to yourself, to the friends around you. And the other issue is place. Do you have a sacred place in which you can write or dance or compose, whatever it might be? Everybody has these problems. Oscar-winning screenwriters, but also fifth graders trying to get their one page or maybe one paragraph story into the English teacher. Sacred time, sacred space. So that's an intellectual notion. The way that I make it visceral in this book is I outline 9 fires. And I suggested at any one stage of that, the original inspiration, you think about it as a fire. Suddenly you're on fire. We use that expression, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what? The world out there would love to take a fire hose to your fire and douse it. And by that, I mean, the minute you say to somebody, I'm going to write a collection of my short stories, or I'm going to write a memoir, I'm going to put all my photographs together in a book, the cynics come out. Who are you, CJ, to write a book?
Mm-hmm.
Phil, who do you think you are to put a book of photographs out there in the world or to make a TV show? Our fires go out again and again and again. Sometimes we put it out, maybe with our anxiety or our sense of worthiness. I get this a lot. I'm not worthy. I'm inspired, but I'm not worthy. My book, then, Stoking the Creative Fire, is designed to help people who are stuck or frustrated at a crossroad with their creativity. And what I have found over the years, teaching now, 36 years or so, if you can visualize where you are on this circle, you are 100 times more likely to actually get home again and to finish it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't know, then that's when people start self-flagellating, like those people on Good Friday in the Philippines, self-flagellating themselves. It's a horrible image, but a lot of people do this. They whip themselves. So what I'm trying to do in the book is elegantly simple. Are you at the beginning stage? Are you still on fire? Is your fire beginning to fade? Where are you? Have you talked to a mentor? Have you thought about taking on a mentor? Being humble enough to go and ask someone generally older, not always, but generally older. Or are you so anxious, so depressed about your creativity that you are lost in the labyrinth, that great image from Greek mythology? If you
Right.
can name it, if you can name that place in the journey and the name of the fire, you are so much more likely to get home and finish it.
You talked about the various stages in the book of the creative cycle. So one is celebrating the waking dream of reverie, having courage to seize the moment, and seeking wisdom that you basically just talked about in when you were talking about the fire. And I have a couple of, and I found myself. I'm writing right now. I'm not finding exactly the experience that you're talking about. When you talked about finding space, what does that feel like and mean for you when you're finding space? Like when you're in that writing space, in that place, what does it feel like for you?
That I'm home in the archetypal sense of being home. If people, so I've been in India, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that even in the poorest of homes, hard scrabble dirt floors, bamboo, palm frond leaf roofs, and so on, there was still a corner of the poorest house for prayer. And I haven't been able to get that image out of my head in the best sense of that phrase, because what it means is economics doesn't have anything to do with it. Having the latest software and the greatest computer doesn't have anything to do with it. Going to a hipster cafe as opposed to a local chain coffee shop. It's where you feel comfortable and you can go into what you just announced. I think it's chapter 2 or 3 in the book, where you go into reverie. If we don't slip into this state called reverie, which is halfway between dream and waking, we can do some of the grunt work. We can do research and find facts and information and so on. But the deep imaginative work, the real creativity, takes place in reverie. And reverie only happens if we are in, for lack of a better phrase, a magical zone. And that's going to be different for everybody. It could be a walk in the woods. It could be a walk along the bay. It could be going and spending 5 minutes in a local church because it might be the quietest place in town. It could be a corner of your own home. But if you have even a fancy writing studio set up in your place, but you sit down and you start to write and you are checking your email every 5 minutes, you're not really home. You're home without being home. So what I'm saying in the book is find that place. Here's probably the most elegant phrase for it. Find the place where you can lose yourself. Because if you don't lose yourself, you know who's present? The inner critic, the inner censor. Oh, you're not good enough. You better rewrite that. This will never sell. Oh, you'll never make any money. Part of the deal of carving, would be a good verb for it, carving sacred time and sacred places, you drop into reverie and you lose track of yourself. Why is that important? Well, it's dreamy and it feels good, but something else happens. You distract the ego. And the ego is what gets in the way of our real creativity. So what can we do? When we are in reverie, just using Jungian terms, but also every great biography I've ever read, just finishing Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, which is brilliant. He talks about this too. Being on a plane, being on a bus, going across country, taking 5 minutes to be completely alone in the back of the bus. That's where the songs come. He can be alone in the middle of even chaos. And I think it's one reason why the Paris Cafe has become one of the great symbols for this in the 20th century, now in the 21st century, because you can be alone in public. Some of the greatest creativity in the 20th century took place where people were sitting at cafe tables watching the world go by. And they fell into a kind of trance as they did this. I'm talking not just writers and poets, but filmmakers. Matisse and Chagall, great painters, used to say they got their best ideas sitting in a cafe table where all the tables are faced out towards the public, by the way. There are no tables that face inward, which cuts you off from the world. This is taking your unconscious, your dream life, your imagination seriously by saying, I am going to go not to a place that's trendy or hip. I'm going to go to a place where I can fall. That's usually, we use a verb like that. We fall into the dream space. We fall into reverie. Why? Because that's where the new ideas come from. And then you emerge 20 minutes later or maybe 2 hours later and you say, who wrote that? Where did that come from? Unfortunately, some people will use a language like I channeled that, which is really stainless steel to me. That doesn't talk to me at all. It's not, it doesn't feel poetic enough. But when you drop into a space, you're in the zone as if you're playing ball. I was a ball player for years, and this is what you live for those moments when you're not thinking. You've trained yourself so well that your body is responding of itself. And that's why I want to talk on Saturday night in Seattle at East West Bookstore about the writer's life. Because I take this issue of the imagination. Coleridge talked about the holiness of the soul's imagination, something like that. And what he's saying is this is really amazing, intoxicating, sacred territory. Often people resent others who are creative. It hits a raw nerve that they aren't leading creative lives. And I say that with the greatest compassion. And so people can act cynical around us, derogatory, but we do it to ourselves. Our anxiety, our sense of guilt. We're writing a book and we're not paying attention to our family, for example. So how do you get around that? By being constantly alert to the signals of the world that can blossom, can spark into a project. Here's an example. It's easy to say dreams can be inspiring. They can trigger whole symphonies. They say Mozart used to wake up with entire symphonies already composed in his head. And all he had to do was light a candle and spend 15 minutes writing all the notes down. That's almost incomprehensible. But there's a spark there. There's a famous story in which Alfred Hitchcock said that he woke up one morning with an image of the great actor Cary Grant hanging for his life off of the nostril of Abraham Lincoln on Mount Rushmore. Now, most of us would just go back to sleep, turn to our spouse and say, oh, I just had the craziest dream. But an artist, a creative person, and I don't want to make this elitist at all.
Yeah.
We're alert. That could be a story, or that little snippet of conversation. And what you do is take the dictates of your own soul's signals a little more seriously. Again, not trying to be elitist about this. You write down that goofy thing that your child said. Hitchcock writes that down, and he actually called, the story goes, he wrote a few words of the image down on a piece of paper, and when he woke up a few hours later, he called the famous screenwriter Ernest Lehman and said, "Here's this image. Now write a movie about this." And what they did was write backwards. That is how the movie ends.
Wow.
And all Lehman had to do was ask a basic question, and this is the what if principle of creativity. What if Hitler wasn't assassinated in the bunker? What if Cary Grant was accused of something he didn't do, and he's chasing these spies, and he ends up on Mount Rushmore? This is the what if principle of creativity.
Wow.
You can write stories, songs, you can carve sculptures out of this, but the principle is the same. Never go anywhere without a notebook.
Yeah.
Never go anywhere without pen and pencil. And it only takes a few seconds, just a few seconds, right? I actually have a few beer coasters that I think will end up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because of drinking with Van Morrison until dawn a couple of nights. And I didn't want to be, what do you say, ostentatious, taking notes down while he was talking and when the whole band was talking. So I rested the beer coasters on my knee, and I wrote, without even looking, a few notes of what it was like for him to sing with Jim Morrison and the Doors.
It. Yes.
Because I knew this may never happen again. And this is something that, even this morning, I've had two script and book consultations this morning. And I said the same thing to two people, which I often talk to students about. If you're uncertain about what to write about, what to create, or you're overwhelmed, there are so many things you could write about, try this. What would disappear forever if you didn't write about it?
Right. And what is it for you? So, if writing is an expression of the soul, and your creative genius, what is it for you when you look back at your life and reflect your life? What is your soul saying through your books, and the focus on the hero's journey?
This is what I am meant to do. Since I was a boy, I knew I was a storyteller. But then more than that, I needed to see the stories in print. Not everybody feels this. I have, partly because I was born into probably one of the last families in America in the 1950s that read books out loud together. So it wasn't an affectation. Our television broke, this 6-foot-high Philco television, and we never fixed it. And my dad just boldly announced one night, from now on, we are going to read books out loud, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights. Wow. And we did for most of my youth. We got through the Iliad and the Odyssey. We got through Moby Dick. We got through Mutiny on the Bounty, lots of Mark Twain, Grimm's fairy tales. So I began to make this connection with my love of stories, going to the movies, reading books, with the possibility that I could be a participant in this. A few years ago, I saw an interview in a magazine with John Updike. And the last question, if you remember how magazines work, lower right-hand corner, there's in bold, there's this question. So why do you really write, Mr. Updike? And then it says, no, go to page 105. So I have to leaf through the whole magazine. And I'm really expecting one of our greatest novelists to be going on for another 5 pages because it's such a complex question.
Yeah.
I flip it over, and it's a 1-sentence response. I write to be loved.
Oh.
I was staggered, and I've never forgotten that. That is one of the X factors. And I don't mean this in a narcissistic sense. You're not doing it for the flattery. It's something else. You write the most true and soulful thing that you can, or paint if you're a painter, or sing if you're a singer. And the love that comes back to you is the love for the thing that you created, not for your artistic ego. That is where a lot of the self-destruction comes in the world of the arts, where the singer, the writer, the actor mistakes who or what they became while they were creative for the work. If you take too seriously, you are the greatest actor in the world. You can, if you see an interview like this, you see someone's head expanding on camera right at that moment. The hat pops off because it doesn't fit anymore. But instead, if you think back and say, what they love is who I became on screen, or where I went when I told that story about building a go-kart when I was a kid. That's what people love. They love the creative work. And I think that's healthy for those of us who are in this line of work, so to speak. What people love is the story. And they love you for doing it to some extent, but don't get too obsessed about that. Focus on the work. And this notion, I spent a lot of time with Campbell when we were working on the hero's journey. And one of my favorite aspects of that was when we would meet, I would get him on the phone. Hey, Professor Campbell, Joe, would you like to meet for the long conversation? And this was something we came up with that I now use with my own students. I'll be talking about it at East West Bookstore this weekend. What that means is anytime people like you and me and our friends and our family, we sit down and say, tell me what you remember about your grandparents. You've never told me how you fell in love with your husband. Could you tell that with me? Or someone asks you, my God, someone told me that your father died last week. Can you tell me about that? See, I'm getting a little chill just talking about this. Why? These are the eternals. This is a way to leapfrog over small talk. I think people long for this. They long for the long conversation in which you find yourself talking about things that people have talked about since Paleolithic times.
Right.
And when you're in that, some of us, not everybody, but some of us have this. It could be an obsession. It could be a compulsion. It depends on personality. Some of us are compelled to record it. Now, you know I love word origins. 2 or 3 of my books are about word origins. This seems like one of the most innocent words in the world, but it actually goes back to the old French, recours, and what it means is to move something back through your heart.
Oh, wow.
So think about that for a second. You record grandma's conversation in the old folks' home. You record the birth. You record this conversation. You record with words. Sometimes you record music or a movie. Why do we do this? Here comes one of the gists of why I do what I do. And I know you're wanting to go in that direction. Artists get to live life twice.
Beautiful.
You have a phenomenal insight or an experience. I'm writing right now about filming in Iceland a few years ago. Oh my God, I get to live it all over again.
Right.
And there's something it's charming, but it's also intoxicating. For most people, it's what's next? What's next? And it becomes a kind of mania. But someone in the arts has the privilege of going back and not just reliving it, because that can be another form of narcissism, but doing one other thing that's important. And that is trying to find out what really happened.
Okay. I have a question because I've had situations where I want to write it down. You know, you talk about having a spark of creative genius, and you want to go write it down, and you make the time, and you write down. I end up writing down a third of it, and then I'm like, oh, I'll get back to the rest of the 2/3, and I don't, and I'll think, oh my gosh, now I've forgotten. How am I going to remember? Does it matter, writing down an idea fresh, or is it just the idea of going back and looking at that idea with a new pair of eyes a month from now, 2 months from now, that you, like what you just said, that you really learn what it was all about?
That's great. These are the things I love to talk about. Um, what it brings up first is this belief that poets and philosophers have wrestled about since at least the ancient Greeks, and I know it goes back to Chinese philosophy as well. And just to paraphrase it, but it does get to the heart of the book and what I want to talk about this weekend in Seattle, and that is, we don't know what we really think until we read what we have to say.
Mm.
So what do you think about the current president? What do you think about capital punishment or murder or falling in love? Do you think there is a life after death? Now, for these big questions, most of us would say, of course I know what I think. It's so obvious, right? And then you sit down and you start to write and you realize, I don't know.
I just approached one of those today.
Right.
I wrote down I was writing a letter to my father who's dead, which is, of course, why am I writing a letter to my father who's dead? But I thought I was led by my unconscious experience through my meditation to write a letter to my father who's dead, to reconcile a pain that I have in my heart. And it was so hard to write. I just stood there staring at my computer, like 3 sentences dribbled out, and that's it.
It's actually a very great exercise. I have students do this, often to get over a block, get out of the contemporary world, right to someone who's passed on. You will be able to say something that you probably couldn't say in real life. It's also an act of gratitude. It's an act of reconciliation. You can even say what you just did. Grandma Dora, who I write about in so many of my books. Everybody's, well, who was this woman anyway? I'll say, I'll write her and I'll say, I really wish we had talked about how you came over from England in 1911 on the Lusitania. I didn't know that when you were still alive. My mom, who's now your age when you died, she told me, didn't I ever tell you that, Philip? Your grandmother came to America, to the New World in the Lusitania. So I begin to write to that. And then what happens is it loosens up something. It shakes up the unconscious, and it allows not just things and facts, but emotions.
Oh yeah, that's happening. I
return.
wrote one sentence. It was just like,
tell.
it's just thinking about
tell.
your grandma,
Yeah.
my dad. It's just like, ah!
Well,
Yes.
This is good. And then what it brings me to is the major point that it's a little controversial, but I've come to believe in it. Rarely do we get 100% of an experience in the moment of the experience. Now, maybe if you are a bodhisattva, if you are some super realized spiritual being who is completely present, maybe.
Right.
But most of us are mortal.
Right.
Most of us are human. And we're thinking about many, many other things in the middle of, let's say, what's supposed to be wrestling around with your lover, walking through what I just did last week, walking through the ruins of the fires up in Santa Rosa. And I'm looking and I'm heartbroken. Thousands. I'm walking through and driving through thousands of destroyed, incinerated homes. And I know I'm seeing a lot. I'm feeling a great deal, but I'm not getting all of it. So I stop. I talk to a couple of people on the side of the road. How are you? I hope that's your house that's standing that survived. I'll take a couple of notes, shoot a couple pictures. And it's because I value my life. I value these encounters. And I want to go back and I want to get to the bottom of it. So I'll look at the notes a few minutes later to hitchhike back on what you were asking earlier. It's in the return to the notes where we can actually flesh out not just the encounter, but the emotions. Emotions are what push stories. It's not just getting the fact. That's journalism, and it's got a great, noble place in the world, but it's through poetry and memoir and short stories that we get the meaning out of our life. And in the end, that tends to be what I've done. So I'm raised in Detroit in the 50s, and I've come to realize that now I've lived long enough where I remember things that the next generation has forgotten, or a lot of people I went to school with don't remember. And I said, Consineau, how do you remember these things? Because I've been taking notes since I was about 12 years old. I know it's obsession. I used to stop basketball practice. Oh, can you guys, 2 minutes here, go scribble some notes on the side. But it means I have a near photographic memory for certain passages in my life but even that memory isn't quite enough. That's not art yet. Now I have to pass it through my heart.
Oh, wow.
That's the recording aspect of it, where you take the notes, not just what happened, but I take notes in every book I read, every movie I see, every concert I go to, cafe conversations. And then, and this goes back to Campbell's main piece of advice to me, which is pretty cool. Joseph Campbell was my mentor, right?
Yeah.
So I tell him, Joe, I'm using some of these ideas about myth in the movies here. I hope you don't mind. I'm talking about myth in the modern world. And you remember that old word avuncular, uncle-like?
Yes.
I remember he patted me on the knee and he said, Phil, just make it your own. That is the secret of the creative life. We can record and just tell things how they were. X thousands of homes burned. Oh my God, that's horrible in Santa Rosa. What did it mean? What did it mean? Will the phoenix rise again? Now we're in the realm of the creative imagination.
Wow. Okay. That is just so profound. I'm so lost in the story that I've lost my fundamental role in this interview, which is to ask you questions. Okay,
this
but I have a
happens when
question.
we rock and roll.
I know, exactly. Okay, so this is a long conversation, right? We're having that conversation.
There you go.
All right, so here's my sense about you is that you're a super uber creative guy, tons of ideas. What do you do with all, and I actually have the same blessing or affliction, I'm not sure. You have all these ideas, they come up, and you want to act on them, and you act on them, and then you may not complete. Like I have a box full of ideas. How do you move from this ideation, of which I already sense that you are great at, to completion? And how do you also surrender? Like you can't, like if I tried to complete every single idea that goes through this little nut, God help us, I'd be dead. Not enough lifetimes.
To return to the metaphor of the fire in Stoking the Creative Fires, but also in my book of the oldest story in the world. And something else I wrote, Once and Future Myths. I have a major essay in there for me about how Sisyphus is our antidote to the world of constant American self-improvement. We can always be better. We can be more beautiful. We can be cooler. We can be hipper. It's exhausting to be American in that way. And this is not universal. People do not think this way in other countries. So Sisyphus, I'm circling around the question, this notion of pushing the boulder up the hill, it can be taught as a very negative story, one of the Greek myths. You're condemned to push the boulder up the hill, condemned to walk back to the bottom of the hill. That's one way to read it, and that is an interpretation, but I don't think it's the right one. The right one is that it's one of the greatest psychological metaphors ever devised to describe how life is a constant struggle. And we have moments of realization, moments of victory, moments of completion. When we push the boulder to the top of the hill, we take a breath. My God, I married my high school sweetheart. This is it. I'm on top of the world. Like in Titanic, right?
Yeah.
Or I finished the book. Or I got elected city councilman. And then what happens? The boulder rolls back to the bottom of the hill. Now, you can either say, woe is me, everybody hates me. Or as B.B. King, the great bluesman, said, nobody loves me but my mama. And she could be jiving too. So that's the culture that's very immature in America. We are still in the fairy tale as opposed to the myth. The fairy tale says there's one person to marry, there's one job to get, there's one house to build, one life to live. That's the fairy tale because life is tough. So the creative response is to say, I'm going to start all over again. A new marriage, maybe, a new city, a new book. How do you do that? The metaphor in my line of thinking is go where the fire is. If you try to return to the short story, the magazine article, the proposal for a series of dances for your hometown, but there's no fire there, either you will procrastinate, or you, the royal you, or you won't put your real creativity into it because there's no fire. It's too cold. So every morning, in one way or the other, I tumble out of bed because usually I'm going to bed around 4 or 5 or 6 in the morning. So I get up grumpy, as my son is always reminding me, oh, you're grumpy again. And I futz around for a half hour or so. And out of all the projects that I'm always working on, because I usually have 2 or 3 books in the works, working on 2 or 3 TV shows, a few movies, lectures, I suppose I could make life a lot easier on myself if I had a very orderly way to get through it all. Sometimes I do if there's a deadline, like a book contract. So that's different territory. But otherwise, and this is more useful advice for people, ask yourself, is your body lunging, so to speak? Is your heart, can you feel your heart racing a little bit? Because, oh my God, I can get down to the cafe in 15 minutes and I'll have 2 hours to work on my memoirs. If you can feel your breath racing, your heart racing, it's not all intellectual is what I'm saying. It's in your body. The truth of what you should be working on is actually in your body. Does that make sense?
It does. But then what happens if you had one truth that was in your body, you finished it on Monday, and a month later, you don't go back to that truth? Like,
Right.
do you just, it's kind of like these abandoned wayward children that I've left along the side of the way. I feel bad because I don't have the fire to go back.
Well, that's a very valid, it's a reasonable question. There is no one answer fits all. Everybody has to come up with their own solution for this. Generally speaking, what I would say is if you are alert to your imagination, if you're alert to your body, your heart, soul, pick your metaphor, the overlap between the two, what was it? The German poet Novalis said the soul is there where the inner and the outer world meet. I love that because it's really, it says you are the combination of your imagination and your spiritual life in your body. There is an overlap there. And creative people are very, very alert to the overlap. So not one thing is more important. Your body is more important than your mind. Well, that got us in a lot of trouble. 2,000 years of Christianity demeaning the body.
Right.
But you can also vaunt the intellect over everything else. Anyway, find the overlap and then be alert to that. And think about this little story. The great photographer, my model, Henri Cartier-Bresson, the great French photographer, tells this delicious story about working in his studio one afternoon. And he looks over and he sees there's a little slip of paper has been pushed under the door, the crack in the door. So he walks over and he picks it up. And it's a very crudely made announcement for an opening exhibition of sculpture that happened to be by one of his friends, Giacometti, which is this famous Romanian sculptor. And Cartier-Bresson says he was infuriated because it was unprofessionally done and he felt offended. I'm a busy man and you're inviting me to your opening tonight. So he walks over very, very self-righteous to the studio and says, how could you do this? And Giacometti's answer could be the solution to a lot of our creative blocks. He says, there's a point when I have been either drawing or creating my sculptures when I can say to myself, this is who I am now. This is who I am today. I might be better tomorrow. Maybe I was better 10 years ago. This is who I am now. This is what I can do. This is the best of what I can do now. And I can live with that. There is such a cool wisdom in that. It leaves simple enough to say, maybe in 6 months I'll be a better writer. Maybe I'll be, if I keep at it, I'll be a better sculptor. But today, I'm going to take some pressure off myself. This is who I am.
Right.
Because the option is, I won't name names, but I know a fair amount of actors in Hollywood because I do work down at some of the studios. And there are some who are so hard on themselves. They never see their own movies.
Wow.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. But to me, that's emotionally crippling. Because it means I hate every scene that I'm in this movie. I hate the way I delivered all that dialogue. This is brutal. Sometimes I think of this as soul rust. This kind of self-criticism, I'm not good enough.
Right.
I'm not good enough. This isn't, I'm going to be so criticized for this. That can eat us out, eat us from inside out, so to speak, as if there's a kind of rust in our soul. And in the end, we won't release anything to the world. So my feeling is just get to that point where you say, this is the best I can do now, today. And you know what? Tomorrow, I'm going to try even better. I'll write a new essay tomorrow. I'll write a new short story. So this isn't the end. I've got more in me. Right? Does that help?
Yeah. Well, how do you surrender the stuff? I'm sure there's stuff that I'm sure you have about 1,000 creative ideas a day. So how do you surrender the ones that you're like, oh, but it's so good. Oh, I wish I could go back and do that.
Two things, actually. And I like how you came in through the back door on that one, because I've read, my God, scores and scores of books on both the writing life, but also creativity. And this is something I haven't ever seen anywhere. So this is one of those moments where you say, this might be an original idea, even in a world where there's very little originality. And it's this. And I continue to do it because it has a profound effect on students. Two things. What are you on fire about? Only write about what you're on fire about. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on for a one-day class, or let's say the week classes, which I offer every year in Ireland or Paris or Greece. It's really great for someone to travel there, and you're self-enclosed. You're cut off from your email. You are cut off from your friends and all your responsibilities. So much work can be done in that amount of time. So what are you on fire about? Don't fool yourself. Don't fool me. What really sets your hair on fire, as the mystics used to say. Then the second question is, out of all the things you could do, out of all the things you could write, what would make the greatest contribution? That gets us out of our head. It gets us out of this whole business about cultural flattery, getting your cultural bona fides. I've published X amount of books. How many have you published?
Right.
Because it's in something else. For example, a couple of years ago, a book came out of one of the episodes that I did on Global Spirit, the show that I host on PBS and co-write. And it was a show about forgiveness and healing, and about how forgiveness is the first step, but there's something missing unless you actually make some attempt at making amends, restitution, atonement, depending on your language, of course. That's what solidifies it. I interviewed Gandhi's grandson about this, and he told me his grandfather, it was fun just to hear him say that. My grandfather, and he's talking about Gandhi, right? Yeah. My grandfather said deep reconciliation has two pillars. One is forgiveness and the other is atonement. You have to prove that you're sorry for what you did. You have to make an act out there in the world. So this is being used by the military, in prisons. This one show is being shown all around the world now. And a book came out of it. And as I began to write it, including interviewing this Arun Gandhi and others, I kept getting told, this book will never sell. Americans love to talk about forgiveness, but they do not like to talk about making amends.
Hmm.
They want to go on with life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I admit it. I stole $1 million. I embezzled, but can you forgive me? Then can we go on and not talk about this ever again?
Right. Right.
But here's the thing. I knew I wasn't going to make any money on this, but the culture, I really believe, needed the book. I believed in my heart of hearts that the book, this effort, would make a contribution.
Mm.
So I stuck with it for 2 years.
Wow.
I had a small grant to finish the book, but I will never see any what they call royalties on this.
Right.
However, an amazing thing happened. And so I'm telling this anecdote as a kind of parable. And that is, you do not know where your writing is going to end up. It may disappear. If it is full of heart and soul and it's timely, you could, in a modest way, change the world.
Hmm.
So what happens with this book? One of the contributors helped get it to the U.S. military, who are now offering the book to returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh my God. That makes me cry almost. Wow.
You probably
Wow.
know, as many listeners would, that the
Wow.
suicide rate in Vietnam it's now 3 times more Vietnam vets have committed suicide than died in Vietnam during the war. And now we're getting numbers like that from Iraq and
Wow.
Afghanistan. As horrible as the death and the casualty rate is in the actual conflict, we have more suicides for the soldiers coming home because nobody wants to talk about this.
Yeah.
And that isolates you. So how does a book, of all things, CJ, how does a book help? It's such a
Mm.
curious alchemy.
Mm.
What it says is, no matter what happened out there, if you were violated or you did something reprehensible, all spiritual traditions have believed that you may not make exact, commensurate difference. You killed somebody, you brought somebody back to life. It doesn't work that way. But you can do something that announces to your soul and to the soul of the world, as the ancients used to say, that I am sorry and I will spend the rest of my days trying to make amends for this. This is putting energy that you took out of the world back into the world. And now I'm getting letters from prisons. Prisoners
Oh,
are writing
wow.
me saying that this actually happened. One fella, God bless him, he said, a friend of mine committed suicide 2 days before your book arrived for our writing class.
Oh,
We wish he would have been able to read it. I was thinking about suicide, and then the group of us, we read your book, Beyond Forgiveness, Reflections on Atonement,
oh
and
my
I've
goodness.
decided there is something I can do to make up for what
Oh
I
my
did.
God, that is amazing.
So
Wow.
this is a way to expand on this notion of contribution.
Yeah.
These are not empty words for me. I believe this heart and soul, and I've been trying to live it as well.
Mm.
Ask yourself, would it help a child somewhere? Would it help someone who never reconciled with her father? You writing your memoirs. I'm helping someone now from London who came and took a class with me in Chartres in France 2 years ago, and then came all the way to Ireland with me a few years ago. Why? Because she suddenly realizes she is the last amongst her friends and family who remember the German Blitz. She lived in London. She's in her 70s now.
Mm.
She survived the Blitz. And there's something in her that resonated when I said in France 3 years ago, is there something that you have experienced that would disappear forever unless you write about it?
Mm.
And so she has stopped her life, in the best sense,
Yeah.
to write about things that could just disappear like the morning dew, unless she gets it down on paper.
Mm.
To me, this is a contribution. This is what I want to talk about this weekend. It's what I'm talking about in all my work. Tell the story. We are desperate for stories. We're
Mm.
desperate. And we're soul hungry. And how do you feed the soul? Through stories.
I love it. You are a beautiful soul. I'm just so touched. You're getting me bawling on the air. God, I was actually trembling at one point when you were telling me the story. That is just so
Wow.
so beautiful. Really,
Thank
it's just
you.
a
Thank
beautiful
you.
story, and you're a beautiful soul. And I look forward. I'm going to go to your class. I'm going to
Oh,
go
I
to your
hope so.
class. You come to
Please.
Seattle. You're going to come
Please.
on this Saturday and Sunday, and I know that you have an evening lecture on a Saturday, and then on the Sunday you have a fuller class
It will be an afternoon workshop in which
workshop.
we actually move through the stages of the what I call the creative journey, because it's visual. If you can look at your work as a journey, there's a good chance you'll come home again.
I love it. I love it. I'm going to be there. We've been talking about your book, Stoking the Creative Fires. Thank you so much.
I'm a fairly prolific writer, filmmaker, work in every imaginable medium, but I also teach writing.
Right.
And it is one way for me to stay prolific. This is the irony. People think that it exhausts you. Well, it exhausts some people to teach. I give so much when I'm actually teaching workshops and lectures and so on, writing retreats, that it comes back to me. And that allows me to keep going and being ever more creative. But the hurdle, which what I find very useful for people, is to begin with the craft and say, in the end, it's really about the writer's life.
Mm.
You lead a life in which the art, the writing becomes inevitable. There's no magic trick.
Mm-hmm.
We end up talking about what it's like to live a life as a writer, a life of
Mm.
conversation, a life of travel, and so on. And in the end, that becomes extremely useful for people.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.